Thank you so much, Kai, for the introduction. Yes, as Kai mentioned, I'm very interested in the digital nomad topic, and that, of course, raises a couple of questions around the nation state. I have to say, it's very difficult to even comment because I'm so impressed by the 3 talks that we
mission accomplished.
had. If I might kick off the discussion, and I think that's the common theme that I took away from your 3 talks, is that we might need a different, as we call in academia, dependent variables. So we have been optimizing towards efficiency and money, but we might need a different dependent variable. So the question is, if we're in the tech and biz space, if we don't optimize for efficiency, because as we hit in an earlier talk, money doesn't make us happier. If patient care is actually suffering because of the old structures that we have, how can we turn that around? What is the dependent variable that we're actually looking for? Is it a more less Western-centric mindset? I was very pleased to see that it was not an Asian person, but at least it was a female person giving the talk.
I tried.
I think, Rob, I'm greatly impressed by your talk. I'm born on the 27th of March, which is primarily famous for my birthday, but it's also famous for the Tenerife disaster, which was the disaster that cost most lives in an aviation disaster in all time. It was 2 planes crashing on a small airport in Tenerife. And the main factor for the crash was that the pilot of the airplane making the mistake was so angry and so keen to go that he didn't realize that the other airplane had not cleared the runway where he was supposed to take off from. It was both channeled to one runway, that was the problem. And the co-pilot was aware of the situation, but because of the same power structure that you mentioned in the healthcare sectors, he would not be speaking up. Rather, not speaking up, unfortunately, then 600 people burned to death. That's not so great. So you might need to overcome. And I know that's a big problem in any scenarios. We have thanks to people like you, we're calling that out in the health sector in Australia much more often now, but this is still an ongoing problem with this old structure. So if efficiency and money is not, the dependent variable that we're optimizing, against what are we optimizing, or what are we trying to work towards? Could you comment on that?
I mean, if only everyone would just do what I said. But so we've been solving for efficiency. I think we need to be solving for actually solving problems. So we have the data now to know just how screwed the world is. So I would say we need to be solving for unfucking the world. Just going to put it out there. So, when we take a look at what companies are actually putting into the world, if they are solving more problems than they create, how can that be a dividend? How can that be beneficial? How can they be supported by government? If we live in a globalized world, our problems are now globalized. So we can't have these individual fragmented companies just solving for their own bottom line, or even just solving for efficiency. I think we need to work actually as a system now that we have the propensity to do so.
I'd agree with Andrea, and I'd probably use the same language as well.
Just say the exact same thing.
I like Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. It's like, why are we doing what we're doing? For me, working in healthcare's lost touch with why it's doing what it's doing. It should be doing the best for patient care. This is a call for help. So it's like in every industry, we should be thinking, well, why are we doing this? We're not just doing it for the money. Yeah, if you want to do things for the money, don't bother. Just do it. Find out why you're doing it, and everything just resonates around that. And just keep true to yourself. I think people around the world are generally very, very good people. I mean, and they all want to do the right thing, I feel, and basically, things can get skewed quite easily. So whatever background you're from, if you know really why you're there, and I think that customer, interface is where it's really important. What are you leading to try and deliver, and so why are you doing it, and just keep focusing on that.
I'll have a go.
Use the F word.
Use the F word.
Yeah, wait. Great.
I haven't used the other word. I haven't used bullshit today, and we've said it on every single episode of our podcast now for 150 episodes. So, apologies for that. I think two things for me in there. One is that Yeah, so one is around efficiency. I think there are ways we can go with efficiency itself. I remember a story that I think Mike related to me, but I think it's Genevieve Bell's story about elevators. If you go down to Barangaroo, you know, the big towers, they're next to my place. The question of where do elevators hang out when no one's using them? And what do you optimize for? What's efficient for those elevators? Is it to sit in the right place to take people for lunch as quickly as possible when it's, you know, close to 12 o'clock and people are taking the lunch break? Where do they hang out? And turns out they hang out, the elevators hang out where it's most energy efficient. Not where it's best for the people who work in that organization, but where it's most energy efficient. So that is one question around efficiency where we want to raise those questions. Second, I don't think that question ever got easier. If you look at how people have tried to answer, how do we teach cars to kill? Self-driving vehicles, we have to teach them to kill people. If you've looked at how people have tried to answer that question never got easier. Should it run over the old lady or the 3 children or save the passenger in the back, and who should get to decide that? So I think that's still an ongoing question. For some of these things, we have actually done work at the University of Sydney. So for instance, we've launched a big report on rethinking education in the age of AI and automation, and thinking about what we solve for. So following on from your point, I think you want to think about raising flourishing citizens. That is a very different educational system than one in which you try to raise productive workers for the workforce. And those are all little things we can strive for.
I had a China question about just how powerful China already is, but is becoming increasingly so. How does this sort of impact on this morning's session where we were talking about purpose and climate change and generational shifts? And what I could be completely wrong on this, but what I think I understand is that China really isn't doing very much at all around the environment and resisting climate change and making big changes. So, I mean, how do we resist a little bit the cultural impact of a country where that is actually acceptable, when it sounds like we're a sparrow on the back of a rhino and we've really got no hope of resisting that? And back to the generational shift, can we sort of overlay the Western ideas of millennials and Gen Zs and so on onto Asian cultures?
Okay.
Are they thinking similarly, or is there no urgency?
Really good questions. I'll try and remember the second one, but probably by the time I get there, I will have forgotten it. So please remind me. So China is the biggest polluter. It's also the biggest investor in green tech. And the reason why, I mean, no one likes to just hang around in pollution and just think, wow, this is so great. I'm just loving not being able to breathe and actually dying of pollution-related illnesses. I didn't know you could even die from pollution until I started working with China. So the crisis that presents, though, when it comes to the demographic population, is that you've got an increasing middle class in China. You've got 500 million people that have become middle class since the economic reforms of 1978. They increasingly want a better life. And if you have a population which is suffering from pollution and has enough sort of wherewithal to say, I really don't like this, and you also have a single-party communist state which needs no revolution in order to be there, then you've actually got a crisis. So that's why, one of the reasons why China is the biggest investor in green technology, because it's not just about prettying up the air and making China a better place to live. It's about making the population happy so that they are also along for the ride, along for the Chinese Communist Party's ride, so that they won't disrupt it, won't dissent. So, and that's always the case. It's the same with the amount of money that China is investing in innovation. Is like $300 billion worth of government grants, not funding, not taking equity, just grants to young populations to turn them into entrepreneurs who aren't looking for work, because there aren't enough jobs for young people in China, for the smart people who've gone to university. They're turning them into job creators, not job seekers. Job seekers, young people with time on their hands who are middle class, tend to get angry. So the investments that China makes in these huge global, world-shaping things are as much for political harmony reasons as they are for solving the actual problem. There's always, it's always a system. So when it comes to I won't hog the mic. When it comes to millennials, so the way that things are characterized generationally in China is really in terms of decade. So they refer to the 80s generation, the 90s generation, the 2000s, the 70s, because if you kind of map that with the different changes in China's economy over time, they kind of line up. So the economic reforms happened in 78, so that 80s generation have a really different worldview than the 70s generation. They do tend to lump together the 80s and the 90s generation like we do. They're the millennials. They have they have a ton in common with millennials here in Australia and around the world, partially because they're young, and young people since the beginning of time have had a lot in common, that particular stage of life. But also they do have that social heart. They do want to work in companies that are doing good. It's a big country, right? 1 in 5 people on the planet are Chinese. So this is a lot of different opinions and perspectives within even one generation. So that 80s, 90s generation is 415 million people. That's the size of the world's 3rd largest country, if it was a country. So they have a lot of different opinions, but they are mostly aligned with what millennials think about here. They want to work for purpose, but they wouldn't mind having a Gucci bag or some other designer bag while they're at it. No problem.
I guess, we think a lot about complexity and stuff, but just starting with people's names is great. So, just a great innovation.
It's, we're quite lucky. So we've got numerous projects going on through the Patient Safe Network at the same time. The project just looking at name and role caps, it's got people from all over the world, so professors of surgery from Amsterdam, New York, and New Zealand, because we can work in this way now. I've never met most of these people, but they're constantly pumping data into this. So most of you will have read Dale Carnegie's book, and there's a whole chapter in there all about the importance of names. But there's statistics that we only remember 30% of names after first introduction, and we forget them. It's actually, there are specific parts of our brain that will only light up when we hear our names. It's actually a really powerful communication tool. And so if you went to a cardiac arrest, for example, I'll often, well, not often, but I'll get called to them. There'll be 40 people there. I don't know who they are, but if you are able to use closed loop communication, so David, can you defibrillate this patient? The defibrillation will occur 3.6 times faster than if you say, can someone defibrillate this patient? So we've got these people all over the world constantly pumping more and more and more data into this with sim studies, and just this resistant industry going, no, it's not better, it's not better. I've actually been threatened with legal action for doing what I'm doing. This is how insane these top-down structures can be. And I've got some great friends, Brad at the back being one of them, and my brother-in-law is a creative director and advertiser. I'm constantly batting these discussions off them, and people outside the industry find it really difficult to comprehend why is it so bad. But you speak to people who work with inside it, and it's just the accepted norm. We've become completely disempowered. We can't drive change. When this came about, it was about a year after I was exposed to some severe bullying. So I was just trying to work out what is it exactly that's stopping all this, and how can we change it? And when the idea came about, I was like, well, this is brilliant. I'm always struggling to remember what people's names are, and it won't be accepted. It will not be accepted. I'll be able to show the world how bad this industry actually is. There are people who understand how to fix it. They just don't understand how to get those fixes in. And I think you guys understand how to help those guys get those fixes in. So there's ergonomic experts out there. So going back to the Tenerife disaster, Aviation started bringing in ergonomics, which is also known as human factors, back in the sort of 1920s after a series of plane crashes. Then Tenerife was a real spur, and here you've got the most celebrated pilot for KLM flying, taxiing a jumbo jet at full speed into another jumbo jet. And you cannot carry on training people to be the best of the best and thinking that things won't go awry, in fact, and this is what's happening. There's a whole scientific element here that doesn't exist in the industry. There was one person, one human factors ergonomics expert working in Australia in healthcare. He left 6 months ago. He was so frustrated. But within that time, we managed to poison a few of our minds, and we're struggling. So we need your help, basically. And this is a massive thing. So you're talking about the sparrow on the rhino's back. Here's a huge industry that is about to take off. On Tuesday this week, I'm going to a group called HealthShare. HealthShare procures all the equipment for New South Wales Health. We're going in, and if this is the first time anywhere in the world, it might sound bizarre, but this is the first time anywhere in the world we'll have frontline staff going in and scoring the equipment that we're being forced to work with. It's not happening anywhere. So New South Wales is punching above its weight. And if you want to jump on something, have a look at this space, because if money does drive you, there is a lot of money to be made out of a whole new industry that develops. Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Good point.
I just want to add a little bit to that, Rob, and on behalf of quite a few of us that are educators, well, sample size of one, I want to thank you through learning about what you do through Scott Ward. I follow you on your LinkedIn, and one of the reasons I do is because I get my MBA students, I currently work at Wollongong University, to follow you, not connect with you, because that's a whole other issue, but follow you, because there's so much conversation about innovation and entrepreneurship. Shiny thing, lovely, awesome, we're going to have new degrees, which most of us are currently implementing. And my uphill battle is constantly saying we need to talk about people. And as a talent management scholar, trained as a social scientist with an interest in ethnography, I really like the people. Let's think about how people do their work, how they go about thinking about the process of work, the social environment in which we do our work, and then diagnose what the challenges and issues might be. And I constantly refer to you in the whole, just put your name on a cap. Easy fix, no money, which is great for a business school because we don't want to ask for resources, do we? And it's that whole human element of appropriation of what it is that seems like such a simple solution that everyone outside is like, yeah. And then working with academics to go, what is it about innovation and entrepreneurship that we actually do disarm ourselves with? So I've got some colleagues in the US who are looking at the whole idea that people say they want innovation within organizations, but they don't actually want to actually have you create or bring forward any new ideas. And if you have people at the top that are about the best practice and this is how we do things, then they definitely don't want you to ask questions about why the fuck do we do it that way. And it's really interesting because there is that thing that I'm like, yeah, ask people what they think. Watch how they do their work and then see how those interactions unfold and the barriers that are placed in front of that. So thank you, because I'll continue to use you and your endeavours as a really good teaching case about why we can't really do the things that we want to do within organisations and how we might actually approach that and open up conversations about the people dynamics within the workforce and innovation, creativity, and making the world a better place.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great point, and it just sort of makes me reflect on, I've presented to medical students who then come into theatre. There's a thing called the timeout where everyone, you go through, make sure you're doing the correct operation, correct patient, correct leg, etc. There's a series of tick boxes. It was designed by the World Health Organization. There's one box on there which says each staff member introduces themselves to one another by name and role. The box is always ticked, but invariably it's never performed. So I actually said to this medical student, he'd been to one of my presentations, said, right, this timeout process is going to take place 4 times today. We've got 4 patients, okay? It's very rare that, this box will be ticked, but it won't be performed. I want to see if you can speak up and ask people to do it. And every time, he couldn't bring himself to do it. There's no way. You can't tell these people to be more resilient and speak up into an environment where it's not wanted. They can see that it's not there. As soon as you walk into theatre as a student, you know to shut up. So you shut up. And if you don't shut up, you get your head kicked in. I don't mind getting my head kicked in. So up to a point, because I see it's the right thing to do, but it's also exposing a massive issue in an industry which is the most trusted industry by the looks of things. I read that. Don't trust it. You know, you can see there's a big problem here. And the patient voice is going to be very strong. So there are a few patients now who've gone into theatres and have written their own names on their hats as a protest. You know, it's like, I want you to do this. I want you to look after me first and foremost. So it's shouting back. Yeah.
Just one. Thing is, if anyone kicks in your head, everyone's going to know they kicked in Rob's head.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got a really big shit stirring stick, so I can stir the shit like no one's business. So this thing about safety as well is really important. I had to get myself into a really safe location so I could stir the shit. And that's what I'm doing, just agitate, keep the pressure on. And they'll come at me, but I will keep exposing it. No, I don't say any names, I don't put it in the paper, but if they want to go there, they know that I'm happy to go there now. Game's on.
Just want to add one thing to this conversation, because I think the medical industry is a very interesting space where you have this hierarchy and you have this pressure to conform with the top. And there is one other place that where we've had conversations in this space where I think some of the learnings might apply to the medical space, and that is defense. Funnily enough, we all know cybersecurity now is one of the biggest threats that we face, and the next war will not be billion-dollar targets floating on water. It will be the war in cyberspace, and huge challenges to the Army and the Navy as an organization, that now in cybersecurity, the youngest people working and the newest people working know the most. You've got hackers, you've got 20-year-old kids who know more than the general who is in the room. And how do you listen and how do you change that organizational culture so those voices are heard and those voices are accepted? How do you work with the fact that these people want to work in defense, but then want to go and work for an organization, want to come back to defense? So huge challenges to that traditional structure where the younger voices have to be listened to. So another great space to see some of those dynamics at play and how they resolve themselves.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. My name's Manisha Amin from the Centre for Inclusive Design. So that's my name and my role, I guess. So I think I'll start that from now. So thank you so much. My question is, and it comes through from some of the other questions, is really this intersection between values and the values space and that of power and control. And you've spoken beautifully, all three of you, about how that kind of plays out. I'm really interested in just one example of how you've seen this actually work. So where you've seen that conflation happen and it actually work. I mean, particularly when you work in co-design, where have you, what's a great example of the success? I know sometimes there might not be a lot of them, but I'm really interested in that.
I can answer if you want. So, I mean, the 4-2s initiative, for example, is, I think, it's a very, very, very low-hanging fruit. I had to go even lower than the caps, which is a no-brainer to all you guys, but it's just so much resistance to it. I thought, well, here you go. Here's something that's going to not be resisted. How can you resist standardizing it? It costs, per hospital, $200 to change the number over, to put all the labels on the phones. The 1 minute of theatre time is $150. So about a minute and a half of theatre time, you can change all the hospitals. So this thing is going international as we speak. David Whitaker was at the World Health Organization on the 17th of September. And basically, so Scott, who's here somewhere or was here earlier, he put me onto another platform called Ushahidi, which basically originated in Africa. It was just a platform where people could just geolocate anything really, really easily. So people in hospitals throughout the world are able to geolocate what their number is. It just populates this this map, you can actually take pictures. And this is something I've been talking about for a while. You can have staff and patients walking into hospitals, geolocating things that they're reading about. Oh, I know this fluid bag is actually harmful, and this one here is actually not harmful and it's cheaper. They've got the wrong fluid bag, and we can just build up all of this data. So there is an amazing way to use these innovative tools that exist and use them for a very, very good purpose, because your lives that are at risk, I'm sort of looking around the room, bang, one section of you may just go because of medical error, and we could change that. It's pretty sad, you know, but that's what's driving me. Which side? Put your hands up. That's it. But yeah, so there are successes. Got to go for the low-hanging fruit first, and as you bring about change, I think you bring the confidence to do those things into other people. They see there is another avenue. So I just read another great book recently called Loon Shots. It goes back, talks about a lot of things. I don't know, have you read it as well? Yes, it talks about, you know, this icy sort of structure that you get from command situations. So they don't change, but next to it, you can plant a completely different framework, a watery sort of structure. And this is really what the Patient Safe Network is about. It's about nurturing innovation, and when it gets to that transition phase, that sort of between the ice and the water, where it's a complete no-brainer, like the 4-2s, the caps, we can have people just going in to Parliament and saying, you do this now, and you do it here, you do it throughout Australia, and we'll do it everywhere, because we're all going to suffer. And if we do these things, then we all win. You know, that's what it's all about.
My example, just quickly in China, maybe while we're getting to the next question, is that it happens all the time because it's a command economy. What the government says, you just got to do it.
So what happens when you have the people from Australia co-designing with the people from China, and they have those slightly maybe different value sets or maybe different command and control structures? How does co-design happen there, and what's the interesting piece there that we can learn from?
The interesting piece, so the quick example is in China, if it gets too polluted, the government will say if your number plate ends in an even number, you can't drive your car on even days, you know, and if you've got odd, so it just reduces the number of cars, you know, completely in half. And so they just say it, you do it, and if you don't do it, you get fined, you know, or thrown in jail. So the interesting part is that when people come into the ChinaAustralia Millennial project, they've already elected to work on one of 15 different industry verticals, whether they're from China or Australia or whatnot. So they work on things like the future of energy, the future of money, climate change, you know, it's the kind of the big stuff. We align them with what is in Australia's national interest, what's in China's 5-year plan, and then overlay all of that with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we're trying to find the big shit, you know, that needs big conversations and big economies behind it. So they've already told us that they have shared value. They already are interested in working on the future of energy. No matter how old they are, they might be 35, they might be 18, they might be from China, they might be from Australia, they might be male, they might be female, but they've already told us, I care about this stuff. And so that basis, this is where I think actually, you know, as humankind, we're kind of 98% pretty similar. We focus so hard on that 2% because it weirds us out. But if you actually come at it from a standpoint of saying, we're human beings, you know, we're bald monkeys hurtling through space. We've fucked it up. So, you know, we've got to actually solve these problems together. From that standpoint, then if you establish that shared value, you can have much deeper, richer, hairier conversations about the stuff that you do disagree on, or that happens in different ways in the country you happen to be born in. So, yeah, shared value, number one.
I'll have a crack. I want to link it to one of the earlier conversations, because I think one of the things that invariably happens in this sort of forums, and you're the exception in this case, is that we end up talking about like really, really sexy innovation and these great inventions and things, and we always expect that these will happen somewhere around self-driving cars or something new digital and so on. And a lot of the innovation that we actually need and where we do have shared values is really boring stuff. stuff, where that is in the background, that is not showcased on the front page of newspapers, where no one's shooting anything into space or trying to get to Mars or digging big tunnels. So there's a lot of that type of innovation, and in that space, a lot of the values are shared about human dignity, about health, and so on. And the really simple example that to me was one of these eye-opening things, and I forgot his last name, but his first name is Drew. His first name is Drew, and he's from South Africa, and he wrote a book about flies. And it was a very rich industrialist. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago, and I will put the link in the show notes. But he was a very, very rich industrialist in South Africa, and he said if he could sell canned panda to anyone, he would. He would make money out of anything, and then he had a heart attack just before turning 60, retired at his very, very large farm in South Africa, which happened to be next to a place that grew a lot of chickens on a huge industrial scale. And so every week, trucks going in carrying fish meal, feeding the fish meal to the chickens. Now, out of what we fish out of the oceans, about a third is very small fish that we can only use to grind up and feed as protein to chickens or pigs or other farms. And as he was sitting there and seeing all this news about the oceans being depleted and about the fish apocalypse by 2050 because we'll no longer have sustainable fish, he thought to himself, why are these chickens eating fish? No chickens eat fish, they're not seagulls. And he thought, well, what do chickens eat? Well, they eat flies and larvae and things. So what he did out of his farm, he bought all the guts and the blood and everything that's left when you process a chicken carcass, put them in these huge cages in South Africa and put flies in there. That multiplied in a couple of days. He had larvae that dried under the African sun. He processed the larvae into powder, fed them back to the chickens, creating a closed loop. Now, there's nothing fancy, nothing exciting about that innovation, nothing sexy about growing flies in Africa. But those sorts of things are fundamentally changing industries, and people have no problem agreeing on values, but also producing economic wealth and profits from that.
That might be an unexplored Australian business. Yeah. We have one last question, Claire.
Thanks so much to everyone. And my question is sort of on this track of power, and also going back to the theme of this particular conference. So we've talked about power, and Rob, you've talked about how you've been threatened with legal action and all sorts of things, and so much resistance from the top. Andrea, I'm sorry, I don't see the name on your cap, but you've mentioned how, that video that you saw, it's interesting to me because that we would not be allowed to watch that in China. And if we did, we'd be kicked off that platform that it was talking about. At the same time, we're talking about Australia and this larrikin culture that we have to disrupt things for the better, hopefully. For whether it's in a particular industry with a particular culture or because of Confucius and communism, how do you think we as Australians can resolve this awkward tension that we find ourselves in?
Between Australia and China and the...
Between larrikinism and power structures.
Oh, God.
Good luck.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thanks, man. I'm going to go with... I see larrikinism as code for dudes, white dudes, who are from Anglo background, very specifically, and are allowed to be larrikins in a very particular way that closes their group in and excludes others. So I screw the larrikins. I freaking hate those guys. It was if I wanted the country run by the Footy Show, I would vote that way, but I don't. So I'm stalling for time, man. Come on. I would say my usual answer is that we've got to get more diverse voices in the room to break down what larrikinism is and break down what the power structures are and actually get busy in the grey area, because neither of those things are legit. That would be my struggling, grasping at straws answer.
I'll help you out there. One of the really simple things people could do, honestly, is just travel a bit. I think, or travel a lot. I think for me, I had seen all the things about WeChat and how this functions and so on, and until I actually went to China to get the sense of how that is a power structure, but also extremely empowering for the population there. I really struggled to understand. When I was sitting in a cab a couple of years ago in Shanghai, and this guy came to ask for change and held up a QR code in my window that I should scan with my WeChat to give him change because nobody was using money. When I tried to pay at Starbucks with a credit card and they looked at me like I was slow. And I asked for a receipt to put into Concur, and the guy had to go to the back to talk to the manager, and then they gave me a QR code that said scan with your WeChat app for the invoice. It was a very, very different world. You can go anywhere in China and pay money to anyone. Now, interesting things about what that's creating around the world with parallel payment systems and so on. Think SWIFT, different conversation, but travel a bit. Last 2 weeks ago, I was in China again, and my driver had Google Translate, and I would speak in English, and he would speak back in Mandarin, and we had a fluent conversation about, oh, it started to rain, maybe you don't want to go to the park, I'll take you to the museum, there's this really cool stuff, and if you go through the back, a fluent conversation where neither of us spoke each other's language. So travel.
All right, we are out of time. That was wonderful talks. After I was listening to Sandra's and Kai's podcast, which I genuinely recommend listening to, they are able to put very complex technological and business issue in a very, very interesting and critical thinking narrative. After I was listening to the podcast that the big tech companies are now growing above average, I moved my very, very modest investment from index funds into the Google, Apple ecosystems. And after today's talks, I probably need to move it towards the Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu. And for you, I'm lifting my head. You keep yours on, please. Yeah. Thank you so much to the speakers.